You're listening to international investment advisor Doug Goldstein on the Goldstein on Gelt show, the financial show where we'll talk about how you can make the most of your money. With all the confusing financial chatter bombarding you each and every day, Goldstein on Gelt will give you the practical information you want and need about living a financially stable life. Here's your host, money maven Doug Goldstein.
Okay, we are back. We are talking to Dan Simon. Dan is the co-author with Christopher Chabris of the book The Invisible Gorilla, which was published by Crown Publishers, a division of Random House, earlier this year. Dan is a professor in the Department of Psychology and the Beckman Institute at the University of Illinois. Dan received his BA in Psychology and Cognitive Science from Carleton College and his PhD in Experimental Psychology from Cornell University. He then spent 5 years on the faculty at Harvard University before moving to Illinois in 2002. His scholarly research focuses on the limits of human perception, memory, and awareness, and he's best known for his research showing that people are far less aware of their visual surroundings than they think. His work is published in top scientific journals and is discussed regularly in popular media, and I can certainly say that I myself have used his work many times in talking with investment clients about how they sometimes miss the obvious. So, Dan, I would like to tell you it is an honor to have you on the show and to welcome you.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So in your book, The Invisible Gorilla, you have a certain lesson. Could you describe what the main lesson is that people are supposed to understand from this book?
Sure. The central theme of our book is that we think we understand how our minds work, but we actually have far less idea how our minds actually work than we think. So we often feel like we have a good understanding of how much we see or how much we remember or what we know, and the reality is that those intuitions about our minds are often misguided, and misguided in sometimes really dangerous ways.
What's dangerous?
Well, there are a lot of things that can be dangerous. So, for example, if you think that you'll notice anything unexpected or important that happens right in front of you just by directing your eyes at it, then you're not going to take precautions to avoid the sorts of risks. We don't realize that we often miss the obvious right in front of us, even if we're looking right at it. So, for example, you might talk on your cell phone while you're driving, which dramatically decreases the amount of attention you have available to notice other things and makes it that much less likely that you'll notice something unexpected. We do that because we feel like we'll notice if we're looking out the window. And the reality is, just because you're looking at it doesn't mean you see it.
So in the research and in the book, you describe this problem, right? And frankly, it's rather disturbing because it makes it difficult to trust ourselves. So after someone reads your book, how can he trust himself or anyone else, for that matter, to make smart decisions?
Well, I think that's a really good question, but the goal of our book isn't just to say, hey, you're wrong about everything. The goal of our book is to point out what you can do about it. And the reality is we have these limitations. We have limitations on our memory, we have limitations on our knowledge and our attention, and we don't realize that we do. And you could go through life oblivious to those limits, but that's going to lead to much more dangerous decision-making than if you're aware of those limits and can take them into account. So, for example, if you're investing in a stock and you decide to invest in an individual stock because you feel like you know a little bit about it, you're probably overestimating your knowledge of that stock and that company, because by investing in that individual stock, you're essentially saying that you know more about that stock than the market does as a whole. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty rare that that's the case. I mean, perhaps if you're an insider or perhaps if you're really an expert. Yeah, or you're Warren Buffett. There might be some rare investors who actually do have more knowledge or who can move the market themselves. Mm-hmm. But for most individual investors, the odds that you actually know more about a company and all of the ins and outs of that company than the market as a whole does, and the people who are paid as part of their careers to spend time investigating these sorts of companies, is probably not true.
And yet people will make a big decision, right? And people will still invest nonetheless, or they'll gamble against the casino when they know the odds are stacked against them.
Exactly. So, and sometimes they don't realize how much the odds are stacked against them, but it's really easy to test your knowledge. And what's striking is we just don't do it. Right? So it's pretty easy to ask yourself, do I really know what this company's prospects are for the future? Do I really know what the risks are? Do I know what their liabilities are? Do I know if their manufacturing plant is going to crash? in the next 2 years, in which case, could they survive?
Okay, but even if you do this, Reese, right, those are great questions. Mm-hmm. I would certainly discuss those with clients, right? A client calls me and says, Doug, what do you think of XYZ stock? We'll open the news, we'll talk about it, but exactly what you're saying is that, so they'll talk to me for 10, 15 minutes. I mean, people will make a $100,000 decision in that amount of time, where, of course, it takes them 3 hours to buy a pair of jeans,
Right.
But they'll make huge, life-changing decisions based on very little information.
Yeah, and even if they have a lot of information, there's still an element of randomness and still an element of unpredictability that it's very hard for us to discount. Right? It's very hard for us to take into account. So if you have all of the information, you feel like you've read everything, you've read the entire prospectus, all the fine print, word by word, there's still stuff that you can miss. You can miss a huge downturn in the economy, or if you're a big bank and you're investing in CDOs, you might miss that the whole subprime mortgage market is going to collapse. Right? There are things you can miss even with all of the information right there in front of you. And the danger is that we become more and more certain the more we look at it that we actually know everything, when we really can't in most cases.
So this is very scary, what you're describing. In other words, now I'm more worried than when we started the conversation.
Well, I think one way to think about this is to figure out what are the cases where the limits of my knowledge are really going to be a problem. The example you gave at the beginning of spending 3 hours to buy a pair of jeans is a perfect one. That's irrelevant, right? You can explore all the details of those jeans and come down to all the factors that matter and spend a lot of time doing it, and your decision's really not going to matter a whole lot. Same thing if you're buying, a car stereo or you're buying a new iPod. You can investigate all the specs and all the differences between them, and you can spend hours and hours and hours doing that. And you're going to waver and have a tough decision to make, but really, if you just made one of those decisions and just went with it, you'd probably be happier. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you're just trying to determine which, retirement plan to invest in, that's a decision that has huge consequences way down the line.
But should you spend more time on it? If you spend more time, will it make you a better decision maker?
Well, you can test your own knowledge, right? So if you're worried about buying an iPod, if you don't really know what it means that it can play formats that you've never used before, then who cares about that? But for something like a retirement plan, yeah, spending more time questioning your knowledge, questioning whether it's the right investment makes a lot of sense. Questioning whether you understand what the implications are makes sense. Will you get everything right? No, but you'll get a lot more right than if you don't spend that time and you just kind of go with your gut.
I see. And so you're also suggesting that for decisions that in fact have a relatively small impact on your ongoing existence, like which pair of jeans or which iPod to get, just maybe don't worry about it.
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of decisions that come down to a preference, no amount of analysis is going to lead to a, in quotes, better decision. Mm-hmm. Right? If it's something that you're trying to decide which one you prefer more, and they're fundamentally the same sort of thing, yeah, you could spend an indefinite amount of time gathering more information, but at some point it's just not worth it. You may as well just go ahead and get what you want. Or just go ahead and make a decision. It's the decisions that actually have consequences. If you get one pair of jeans as opposed to another one, it's probably not going to matter all that much to you. I mean, either one will wear out in 2 years anyway.
Right.
But if it's a decision that actually has lasting impact for you, you do want to check it out. So think of it this way. Let's say you're buying a car, right, and you've got a choice between two models. You could look at them and say, hey, I just prefer this one. I like the way it looks. I like the way it drives. I'm going to get this one. And that'd be kind of a going with your gut sort of decision. But buying a car can have lasting consequences. You can have repair bills for a decade. You're much better off looking at consumer guidelines and reliability ratings and all of the data that's available to say, hey, this car is a better bet because it is much less likely to end up in the shop. It's much less likely to be an annoyance 5 years from now. Mm-hmm. That's a bigger impact decision. Spending $100,000 on an investment is an even bigger one.
We are talking to Dan Simons, who is the co-author with Christopher Chabris of the book The Invisible Gorilla, which is a fascinating book about how people make decisions. Dan, in the book, you explain what criminals have in common with chess masters. On the show a little while back, we had, in fact, the world women's chess champion, Susan Polgar, as one of our guests, and we spoke about chess and investing. But could you tell me the connection between criminals and chess?
Sure. So this is referring to a really interesting phenomenon that was, I think, first documented systematically by my colleagues Dave Dunning and Justin Kruger. And what they were looking at was people's confidence, and in particular their overconfidence. So when do people think they're better at something than they actually are? And one of the most entertaining examples of this are criminals who do things that they really have no business doing, but for some reason they think they're good at it. So the example that Dunning and Kruger use in their story, in their article, and that we use in our book, is of a person who, in broad daylight in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, robbed 3 banks with no disguise. And of course, the security cameras caught him, and his footage of the robberies was broadcast on the evening news, and he was caught a few hours later. And when they brought him into the police station and showed him the surveillance video, he was shocked. His response was, "But I wore the juice." And he was convinced that rubbing lemon juice on his face would make him invisible to security cameras.
Oh, my gosh.
Now, this guy's not terribly bright. But what's interesting about this is he must have thought he was good enough at what he was doing to rob a bank and get away with it, right? He wouldn't have done it if he didn't think he could get away with it by using lemon juice. So here was somebody who was truly incompetent at what he was doing. He was a bad bank robber.
Right.
But he was convinced that he was a good bank robber. And this is actually one of the findings that Dunning and Kruger show, is that the people who are the most overconfident in their abilities also tend to be the least skilled. And so they tend to be the people who have the least idea what they're doing. And this is a general principle. Yeah, it applies to almost everything. It applies to things like senses of humor. The people who have the worst sense of humor tend to be the most overconfident in how funny they are.
Or the worst cooks,
everybody
right?
knows somebody. Yeah, exactly. Everybody knows the person who tells jokes that just aren't funny but is convinced that they're hilarious. Mm-hmm. Right? It applies to managers. So if you have a manager who's really overconfident in their ability, they tend to be the least competent ones.
And how about chess masters? So how does this apply to chess masters then?
So that's a really interesting case. So chess, unlike things like senses of humor that are somewhat more ephemeral and hard to measure, or how good a criminal somebody is, in chess there's a rigid ranking system, a rating system that perfectly describes and reliably describes how good you are, how skilled you are. So by knowing your rating, you know the probability that you're going to beat somebody with any given rating. If you play somebody of your own rating, you're going to split the match on average. If you're playing somebody who's much higher rated than you, if I were playing Susan Polgar, I would never win a game because it's just too huge of a gap. In fact, most master level players would never beat Susan Polgar.
Right.
So knowing that rating system tells you exactly how likely you are to beat somebody of your own rating. If you consistently beat people of your own rating, your rating will go up and theirs will go down, so that the next time you play somebody, it's again predictive. So it's what's known as a calibrated system. Now, some years ago with our colleague Dan Benjamin, Chris Chabris and I interviewed tournament chess players at a couple of big national and international tournaments. And we just asked them 2 questions. One was, what's your rating? Which is an easy question. Every chess player knows their rating. They were averaged being within 1 or 2 points of their rating. And it makes sense because the rating's actually printed next to their names on all of tournament schedules and rosters. And the first question most people will ask their opponent is, what's your rating? Right. So it's a really fundamental thing to chess players. It's more important than the person's name or who they are. So you ask them what's their rating, and they get it accurately. You then ask them, what should your rating be to accurately reflect your true playing skill?
Wow.
Right? And the correct answer is whatever their current rating is, because the current rating accurately reflects their playing skill. But what you find is that people on average think they should be rated 100 points higher than they actually are. And it's hard to say what that means, but what it translates to is that they're saying that they would win 2/3 of the points against somebody with their own rating. They'd beat somebody their own rating 2/3 of the time. And that's a huge swing.
And that's a huge sort of paradigm shift. They're not viewing the world as it actually is, right?
That's right. They're assuming that they're more skilled than they actually are. And the kicker is that the people who are the most overconfident, the people who they should be rated much more highly than they are the people with the lowest ratings. And these are tournament chess players who've been playing an average of 10 years. These aren't people coming in off the street. These are people who are playing in national tournaments.
People do this. I mean, I see this in my own office, right? Someone will come in, and I'll do a financial planning interview and say, well, what's the value of your real estate? And he'll say, well, I've got a $2 million property in Caesarea. In fact, he says, I'm looking to sell it, Doug. I say, well, why haven't you sold it? He says, well, they're only offering about $1.3 million.
Yeah.
So it's not a $2 million property. It's a $1.3 million property. So it's, again, I think people will choose a number that somehow fits their conception of themselves?
That's right. And I mean, in chess, it's straightforward why this happens, why people are overconfident at all, which is that, when you're playing a game and you make a blunder, you make a terrible mistake, you think, oh, I just made a mistake, that was dumb, but it doesn't really reflect who I am or what I can do. It was just a mistake. And if I'm playing my best, I'm a much better player. And the problem is, of course, we all make mistakes, and our ratings factor that in, that we're going to make mistakes sometimes. But we discount those sorts of negative things. So if you have the $2 million property, you discount the fact that it runs right next to a railroad track and nobody wants to buy it.
Right. Right, I see. We're just about out of time. We're talking to Dan Simons, who is the co-author of The Invisible Gorilla, a fascinating book about how people make all sorts of poor decisions. I just want to ask one question before we wrap up, which is, why a gorilla? Why a gorilla instead of an elephant or a aardvark, perhaps?
It's a great question. It was just fortuitous. When we were doing the study, Chris and I were at Harvard, and we were doing this as part of a lab, a graduate lab class. And it turned out that one of our very senior, esteemed colleagues happened to have a gorilla suit in his lab. And he actually used it to study temperament in young children. So he would have somebody wear the gorilla suit and approach young children while carrying toys and presents. And the question was, would people run away from it or would they approach and get the toys? But he just happened to have this gorilla suit that he used to scare kids. We figured it would be a good thing to put in. We considered a few other options, but that was the best one we had.
Well, it was certainly a great option, and it is certainly a fascinating read. The book that Dan Simons wrote with Christopher Chabris, called The Invisible Gorilla, is available in all bookstores, and certainly you can buy it online, and I believe it's available as a Kindle book as well. Mm-hmm. So I would certainly suggest everyone pick it up, give it a read to start making good decisions. And Dan, I would like to thank you very much for spending time with us today.
My pleasure, absolutely. And I should just mention that if you're interested, our website has lots of the videos that we talked about and lots of other information. So it's just www.theinvisiblegorilla.com.
Okay, so www.theinvisiblegorilla.com. Thanks very much.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt Show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt Show.